January 1936. Alcatraz Island, Block B, 3rd tier. Al Capone was mopping a corridor when James Lucas came up behind him. Lucas was a Texas bank robber doing 30 years. He had no history with Capone, no grudge, no debt, no reason that anyone could later point to and say, "This is why it happened." He had a pair of scissors he had taken from the barber shop where both men worked. He drove them into Capone's lower back twice before guards reached them. Capone hit the floor. Blood spread across the concrete in a shape that looked almost deliberate, like something had been poured rather than spilled. Guards pulled Lucas away. Capone was taken to the prison infirmary. He was conscious. His pulse was steady. The wounds were serious, but not fatal. The doctors said he would recover. They were right about the body. They were wrong about everything else. Because the man who walked out of that infirmary was not the same man who had walked into Alcatraz 3 years earlier. And the man who had walked into Alcatraz was already not the same man who had once run Chicago like a private corporation. The scissors took something from Al Capone that no bullet, no federal agent, no rival gangster had ever managed to take. They took the last thing he had left, the illusion that he was still untouchable. But to understand what those scissors meant, you need to understand what it cost to put him in that corridor in the first place. And that story begins not in a prison, but in a courtroom. And before the courtroom, in the one mistake that the most careful criminal mind in American history somehow allowed himself to make. By 1930, Al Capone was the most recognized private citizen in the United States, more famous than most senators, more powerful by any practical measure than the governor of Illinois. His organization generated an estimated $60 to $100 million annually in revenue from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution operations spread across Chicago and its suburbs. He had spent a decade building a system so thoroughly integrated into the civic infrastructure of the city that dismantling it through normal law enforcement channels had proven essentially impossible. Police captains answered his calls. Judges managed his cases with a particular kind of deliberate slowness. Witnesses developed convenient memory problems at precisely the right moments. Federal agents who came to Chicago with ambition and clean records found that the city had a way of complicating both. The traditional tools of prosecution, witnesses, physical evidence, criminal charges, had all been rendered ineffective by the simple fact that Capone's money moved faster than the law and arrived at more addresses. What brought him down was not a raid, not a defector, not a mistake made in anger or haste. It was a filing error. Specifically, the cumulative filing error of never having reported to the federal government the income that his organization generated. Income that, regardless of its origins, was subject to taxation under federal law. Frank Wilson of the IRS had spent 3 years building a case that did not require proving a single murder, a single bribe, a single bootlegging operation. It required only proving that Capone had received money, had not reported it, and had not paid what the law said he owed. The case went to trial in October of 1931. Capone's lawyers argued. The jury deliberated. The verdict came back guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence was 11 years in federal prison, $10,000 in fines, and the permanent dismantling of the financial structures that had kept him operating above the reach of consequence for over a decade. Capone stood in the courtroom and heard the sentence with the same expression he used for everything: controlled, unreadable. He was 32 years old. He had been the most powerful criminal figure in American history, and he was going to prison for not filing his taxes correctly. He served the first portion of his sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where the old dynamics of prison life attempted to reassemble themselves around him. Money still moved. Favors still flowed. His celebrity status made him a figure of fascination among both inmates and staff. He received better food than the standard issue. His cell was more comfortable than most. Men who knew who he was gave him the particular kind of deference that powerful men receive even when their power has been formally stripped away. It was not the same as Chicago, but it was recognizable. It was a version of the world he understood. Then, in August of 1934, the Federal Bureau of Prisons transferred him to Alcatraz. The decision was deliberate and specifically designed to end what the Atlanta arrangement had allowed to continue. Alcatraz had been converted into a federal penitentiary the previous year specifically to house the most dangerous and most influential federal prisoners in a facility where influence could not function. The island sat in San Francisco Bay, a mile and a quarter from the shore, surrounded by water cold enough and currents strong enough that escape was not realistically possible. There were no political connections on the island, no ward bosses whose palms could be crossed, no judges whose dockets could be managed, no police captains who owed old favors. There was the warden, the guards, the rules, and the water. That was the entire architecture of Al Capone's new world. He arrived on August 22, 1934, on a train that had traveled from Atlanta with its blinds drawn to prevent crowds from gathering at stations along the route. He was processed, photographed, assigned prisoner number 85. Given the standard issue clothing, bedding, and toiletries that every other prisoner received. Shown to his cell in B block, a standard 6 by 9 foot space with a cot, a shelf, a toilet, and a small window that admitted light but not a view of anything that could be called a landscape. He was 45 years old, and he was, for the first time in his adult life, entirely without leverage. The first months at Alcatraz established something that Capone had not experienced since he was a teenager running errands on the streets of Brooklyn. The experience of being nobody in particular. At Atlanta, he had been Al Capone. At Alcatraz, he was 85. The warden, James Johnston, had established a strict silence rule that prohibited inmates from speaking during meals, during work details, during movement between facilities. The rule was designed partly for general discipline and partly as a specific countermeasure against the kind of social networking that allowed influential prisoners to maintain their influence. You cannot build relationships in silence. You cannot negotiate, threaten, promise, or charm when the simple act of speaking is a violation. Capone tested the boundaries early, made attempts to establish the kind of social hierarchy that had always formed around him naturally, that had organized itself according to his presence, the way iron filings organize themselves around a magnet. The attempts failed. The men at Alcatraz were not impressed by Chicago. Many of them had their own histories, their own reputations, their own reasons for being on the island that made the name Al Capone less a source of deference and more simply a fact about one of the men they shared space with. Some of them resented him specifically. The celebrity attention he received, the letters from the outside, the continuing news coverage that treated him as a figure of fascination while they sat in the same cells, in the same silence, receiving nothing from nobody. The resentment was not invisible. Capone could read rooms. He had been reading rooms since he was 7 years old on Navy Street. He understood that the social mathematics of Alcatraz did not work in his favor, and that the tools he had used to manage social mathematics for his entire adult life were not available to him here. He was assigned to work details, mopped floors, cleaned latrines, worked in the laundry, was eventually assigned to the prison barber shop, which was considered a relatively desirable posting because it involved skill and a degree of autonomy that purely custodial work did not. It was in the barber shop that he encountered James Lucas. James Lucas was from Texas. He had robbed banks. He was serving 30 years and had been at Alcatraz long enough that the island had become, in the particular way that long sentences make institutions become, simply his life. He had a reputation among inmates as volatile, unpredictable, in the specific way that men become unpredictable when they have decided that the consequences of any particular action cannot be significantly worse than the situation they are already in. His history with Capone was essentially non-existent. There had been words between them at some point, minor friction of the kind that accumulated in the enforced proximity of prison life, nothing that outside observers would have identified as escalating toward violence. The scissors were standard barbershop equipment. Lucas had access to them through his work assignment. On the day in question, January of 1936, he took them and approached Capone from behind in the corridor outside the barber shop and drove them into Capone's lower back. Twice. The attack lasted seconds. Guards intervened before Lucas could do more. Capone went down, was conscious, was taken to the infirmary where the wounds were cleaned and closed. He was back in his cell within days. The physical recovery was, by the medical standards of the time and the nature of the wounds, considered complete. Lucas received additional time in isolation. The incident was logged, processed, filed. From the institution's perspective, it was a resolved matter. From Capone's perspective, it was something that could not be resolved because it represented a collapse of something that had been collapsing for years and that the scissors simply made undeniable. He had been attacked from behind by a man he had never meaningfully interacted with, in a place where he had no power to prevent it and no mechanism to respond to it, and the response that had defined his entire adult life, the precise, systematic, untraceable response that had made 12 men cease to exist by sunrise in September of 1926, was simply not available to him. He was prisoner 85. He bled on a concrete floor. And the man who stabbed him went to solitary and came back and continued serving his 30 years. There was no response. There was nothing. And the nothing was the thing that broke him. The neurosyphilis had been present for years before Alcatraz. Capone had contracted syphilis as a young man in his Brooklyn years and had either not sought treatment or had not received effective treatment at a time when effective treatment was not yet available. The disease progresses in stages over years and decades, moving eventually from the initial infection through a latent period into the tertiary phase where it attacks the central nervous system. The symptoms of neurosyphilis are neurological, psychiatric, and cognitive. Memory problems, difficulty concentrating, emotional instability, confusion, a gradual erosion of the mental clarity and processing speed that had been, throughout Capone's life, his single most important asset. The disease had been progressing quietly throughout his years of power. His associates had noticed occasional lapses, moments where the famous sharpness seemed to blur at the edges. But the lapses had been manageable, episodic, easy to attribute to stress or fatigue, or the ordinary fluctuations of a mind under constant pressure. Alcatraz removed everything that had compensated for the decline. The network was gone. The advisors were gone. The system of relationships and information that had extended his cognitive reach far beyond what any single mind could accomplish was gone. What remained was Capone alone, with a brain that was slowly and irreversibly being damaged and no structure around him capable of accommodating or concealing that damage. By 1938, the deterioration was visible enough that the prison medical staff noted it formally in his records. His behavior had become erratic. He was confused at times about where he was, about what year it was, about the basic coordinates of his own life. The man who had once managed an organization of thousands, who had held in his head the names and debts and loyalties of hundreds of politicians and police captains and judges and ward bosses, who had sat in a back room after a 1,000-bullet attack and planned 12 disappearances with the methodical clarity of an accountant, could no longer reliably track a simple conversation. In January of 1939, citing his deteriorating mental and physical condition, the Bureau of Prisons released him. He had served 6.5 years of his 11-year sentence. He walked out of Alcatraz and into a world that had continued without him in every way that mattered. The Chicago he returned to was not his Chicago. The organization had not simply continued operating in his absence. It had restructured around his absence, had found new leadership and new arrangements and new understandings that did not require him and did not particularly want him. The men who had built their careers inside his organization had made the calculations that men in their position always eventually make, which is that loyalty to an institution is more durable than loyalty to a person, and that the institution had survived even if the person who built it had not. He was not unwelcome. He was not threatened or pushed aside in any dramatic way. He was simply no longer relevant in a manner that all parties found more comfortable to leave unacknowledged. He went to Palm Island, Florida, to the estate he had purchased in 1928 at the height of his power, a white stucco house on a private island in Biscayne Bay, with a pool and a fishing dock and grounds maintained by staff who had been there long enough that they constituted, along with his immediate family, essentially the entire world he still reliably inhabited. May, his wife, was there, his son Sonny was there, his mother Teresa visited. The days had a structure imposed by medical routine rather than by the operational demands that had structured every previous day of his adult life. He fished. He sat by the pool. He watched the water. On good days, he was recognizable as a version of the man he had been. On bad days, he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that the people around him could not follow, and that he himself, by all accounts, could not describe or explain when he returned from it. He died on January 25, 1947. The immediate cause was cardiac arrest, following a stroke. He was 48 years old. The neurosyphilis had been eating his brain for decades. The doctors who examined him in his final years noted that his mental age, by the standard assessments available at the time, had regressed to that of approximately a 12-year-old child. The most sophisticated criminal mind in American history ended in a lawn chair by a pool in Florida, watching water he could no longer fully process, in a world he could no longer fully recognize, with a name that everyone knew, and a self that had long since gone somewhere nobody could find. The scissors that James Lucas drove into Al Capone's back in January of 1936 did not kill him. They did not need to. They arrived at the exact moment when the architecture that had sustained him had already been dismantled, when the disease that had been quietly working through his nervous system had already begun its irreversible work, when the man who had been the big fellow was already becoming someone else, in a process that nobody around him had the power or perhaps the desire to stop. What the scissors did was make it visible. made it impossible for Capone himself to maintain the internal narrative that powerful men maintain about themselves. The story in which their power is a function of who they are rather than the circumstances arranged around them. In Chicago, he had been untouchable because of the network, the money, the system, the relationships, the information architecture that extended his reach into every corner of the city. Strip all of that away and put him in a corridor on Alcatraz Island with a mop and a man from Texas with a pair of scissors, and what remained was a man who bled on a concrete floor and could not respond. The lesson is not about Capone specifically. The lesson is about what power actually is and what it is not. It is not a property of a person. It is a property of an arrangement. The arrangement can be dismantled. The person remains, minus the arrangement, and what remains is simply a man in a corridor. Al Capone spent 20 years building the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history. He survived machine guns and shotguns and 1,000 rounds fired at close range. He outlasted every rival who came for him directly. He was brought down by a tax form and finished by a pair of scissors. And the man who stabbed him with those scissors served out his 30 years and died in relative obscurity, while the name Al Capone continued to be spoken by people who had never been to Chicago and never lived through the 20s, and never understood that the real story was not about the power, but about what was left when the power was gone, which was a man by a pool in Florida, watching water, waiting for something that didn't come, and some lessons once paid for stay paid for a very long time.